It's very frustrating when our drawings look cartoon-like, when we're wanting them to have a strong sense of reality, when we want them to look and to feel real. Why does this happen and what can we do about it? I think for most of us, it links back to the fact that our earliest experiences of drawings and of drawing ourselves is connected with the cartoons that we saw in comics and the illustrations of the children's books that we read or had read to us, both in terms of our looking at them, but also our earliest actual drawing experiences. What we tried to copy was very often a cartoon that we enjoyed or a picture from one of our storybooks. These, therefore, have had a really powerful effect in, even now as an adult, a subconscious level, in our trying to work out what is drawing and how does it happen. So I think it's helpful to just consider for a moment, what are some of the characteristics of these childhood comics and children book illustrations? And the first thing is that they're highly simplified. A lot of the detail is removed. These are drawings that can be done, if we know what we're doing, in a very short period of time. And certainly, a lot of the detail that we see in life is removed. Think of the leaves on a tree with our lollipop symbol for a tree. These are often drawn with a continuous line that outlines a shape. And this creates shape rather than form, so we have a two-dimensional look rather than a sense of three dimensions. Even if the two-dimensional shape is actually, if you like, the silhouette of a three-dimensional form, the impact, if nothing else is done, is one of shape. So these illustrations often are very flat feeling. Values, the lights and darks, are also often simplified and, if used at all, brought into the mid-range. Often there's just simplified colours that are applied in a very flat sense. So we don't get the darkening, perhaps, that the three-dimensional form would create in a colour as it moves away from a light source. Continuous line, simplification of detail and of value. So when we start to draw, even decades later and as adults, it's natural that this model of what drawing is and looks like influences how we think about drawing and therefore how we start to draw. It's almost certainly at a subconscious level. We're not trying to draw cartoons. We probably want to draw in something that looks to us a more adult way of drawing, but without realizing it, this exposure influences what we think and therefore how we draw. Now, this approach, and there's nothing wrong with it if that's how we want to draw, can sometimes work okay for fairly simplified shape-based subjects. Its shortcomings, however, become more obvious when we try to draw things that don't naturally translate into a cartoon-like object, not without a vast amount of change, so that it becomes very unnatural looking. So when we draw other subjects, such as this natural scene with trees and leaves and dense plant cover, there's so much detail, there's so many levels, so many layers from front to back, so many interlocking forms, so much shade and variation of value and of surface texture. We find that, in fact, we don't have the tools in the way we've been understanding drawing and being drawing to even know where to start. And when we finish the drawing, and I'm drawing this scene now as trying to apply this childhood cartoon way of understanding, basically using all the things I've said so far, to a complex scene that's the sort of scene that often mystifies people how to draw when the underlying thinking is still related back to how we would develop and draw cartoons rather than a sense of realism in our drawings. But in this case, using the techniques of childhood illustrations, we're finding them inadequate to create any sense of reality. And so we do get this cartoon-like look. And it's because we've used an inappropriate way of thinking about the drawing process for the sort of drawing that we want to create. If we want this to change, then we need to find a different way of thinking, one that will lead us to actually find the marks to put on the paper to create the sort of drawing that we want to create. What might that be? So now I'm redrawing this same scene, but I'm using a different way of thinking. I'm not thinking of copying the photo. I'm not thinking of using lines to outline shapes. Instead, fundamentally, I'm thinking I'm looking at a scene and I'm translating one visual language into a different visual language. I'm translating a photographic language into a language made with a fine liner black pen, a 0.1 fine liner black pen. And so I'm not trying to copy what's there because I don't think I can. Instead, I'm trying to find marks that create the same result, or as I like to think of it, create the same effect. That the way something looks in the reference, I will find marks that will give an equivalent way of looking in my drawing. So that when we see my drawing, we can know what we're looking at. We can understand the meaning of the original language, which is probably no longer there to be seen. So in other words, when we see my finished drawing, we understand, for the background, say, that these are trees, some of which are closer, that we're looking at basically foliage that moves back in certain ways. That there are tree trunks that some are closer, some are further back. In the foreground, there are some things that are very close. We get a sense of where the light is coming from and how that's affecting what we see because of the way I've translated the photo scene into my drawing scene. And I'm not thinking of drawing lines to outline certain shapes. Instead, my thinking is one of I'm finding marks that I can create with my pen by using my pen in all sorts of different ways, holding it in different ways, drawing at different speeds, pressing against the paper in different ways. But I can create a range of marks that I can assemble on my paper in some way to create certain effects. So I'm not so much trying to draw a copy of what I see in my photo. I'm trying to create an effect which reads the same way, which can be understood the same way. And so that's what's happening now. And if you want to compare the two side by side, of course, you can go back to the thumbnail after you've seen the video and just see the two together and see the difference between drawing with an oversimplified, stylized cartoon approach with something that perhaps a way of thinking, a way of understanding what the drawing process is, in this case, for this subject, and the difference between the two. The foliage in the cartoon-like drawing was more of a pattern, really. It was more a curly line, a spiraling back and forth curly line that is more a symbol that represents leaves. That is very common. Now, because it's common, we do understand what it means in most cases, particularly given the context in the drawing. But the question is it effective, and does it create a sense of realism? Does it create as much a sense of reality as the marks I'm using for the foliage here? Hatch marks to really create the values, the lights and darks that we see in our reference, rather than trying to find lines to capture the shape of the leaves, which I think is where this squirrely whirly line comes from. Values are also more important. Creating the darks that are as dark, or at least to some degree as dark as what we have in our reference is important. So we're not simplifying, we're actually trying to capture as much effect as we can, but we don't have to necessarily draw all the detail to do that. In fact, just as well, because it's going to be impossible to draw the detail. But that mindset that I'm not copying something, but I'm actually translating it into a different language is fundamental, because it's what we think we're doing which guides how we're going to do it. But it doesn't just guide, it actually directs. It gives us a way of planning what we might do, and at the very least it gives us some ideas to play around with and experiment with. Now, you can watch this same drawing much slower than this with a full voiceover explaining my process of drawing this, and I'll link the end screen to this video if you want to find out more detail about the actual process of thinking for drawing this and the strategizing of the process and so forth. So if you want to hear that, follow the end link at the end, and please hit the like button for me if you're finding this helpful. But in my experience, this way of understanding has let me draw things that I once thought would have been impossible to draw, or at least any drawings I attempted were very unsatisfactory, because either I felt they looked too cartoon-like, or there was just so much on the paper that it was really hard to tell what was happening where. I found this way of thinking, of seeing the drawing as translating one visual form to another, then finding marks that would create the same effect, the same appearance, even if it was to actually draw something that was quite different to what was in the photo. It gave the appearance, the effect of what was in the photo in a way that was obvious when we looked at it, and therefore able to read it, able to understand it, able to interpret it as the scene of reality that it is, and particularly by playing around with getting the full range of lights and darks of values with the way I assembled lines together, and also to get a sense of three-dimensional form. G'day, I'm Stephen Travers. I hope you found this interesting. How we think is crucial to really everything we do, but particularly to our drawing. So don't neglect trying to understand what drawing process you're using. There's no one right way. It's whatever leads us to the results we want in our drawing. But if we're not happy with how our drawings look, we probably need to understand what we're trying to do more deeply. But in the end, whatever process we use and however the results turn out, make sure you have fun. I'll see you next time. Bye.